To begin the process of stretching your fabric, you need to lay out your bars, like I have here on the screen, with the twill tape facing in opposite directions. Then you simply lay the fabric, in this case it's organza, but it can be any kind of a fabric, on the top of the twill tape. The important thing to remember here is that you need to have the edge of the twill tape even to the edge of the fabric. So now I'm just going to turn it over and pin in a couple of places the fabric to the twill tape. And I pin it from the underside, which you'll see why in a moment. I generally use only 3 pins, one in the center to start with, and then one at each end. You can see on this particular bar that it's been used several times because there's still threads left over from previous uses. So here's the beginning end. So now it's set ready to be stitched. And you can see in this close-up that there is a V in the twill close to the edge of the twill tape. We're going to use that as a guide to do the sewing. And so long as the fabric stays to the edge of the twill tape and you stitch along that V, you will be stitching directly on grain with the fabric. So you always want to watch to make sure that your cut edge or your torn edge of your fabric stays even with the twill tape. You want to start with a substantial knot and several back stitches right on that first V. That helps to keep your stitching in an absolutely straight line. So a couple of back stitches here will be very important because these corners are going to take a good deal of pressure. The length of your stitch is easy to remember. It doesn't want to be too big and it doesn't need to be too small. Roughly about a ½ an inch apart. And it's just a simple running stitch with a substantial thread, or if you're not using a heavier thread, use a double thread of regular sewing thread. It's got to withstand a lot of pressure. And I always check to make sure that my fabric has not slipped away from the edge of the twill tape. And I will just continue to stitch like this all the way down. Here I'm just doing a simple surface running stitch. If necessary, you can stab through from the front to the back and then back to the front. Just make sure you stay right on that V. That's going to be the important part, to make sure that your fabric is stitched squarely on the grain. And then when we get to the end, we're going to do the same thing. I've got to the end of the fabric here, and I need to backstitch it several times just to secure it, so that it doesn't come apart when we start stretching it, because it will have to withstand a great deal of pressure. And you can see how the edge of the fabric is just barely peeking out over the edge of the twill tape. That's how I make sure that it stays right along that edge. And then just clip it out. Now we stitch from this side because if the twill tape or the fabric were dark or an opaque fabric, you wouldn't be able to see that V. So I always stitch it from the twill tape side so I can follow the V, and then it doesn't matter if the fabric is opaque or sheer. Now you do the other side exactly the same way. You just sort of bring the boards back together, line it up, and I generally turn the whole piece around so that I can pin the other side exactly like I pinned the first side. Again, making certain that you have the edge of the fabric completely and evenly along the edge of the twill tape. The stitching is going to be the same. Some back stitches at the beginning. First I'll pin it a couple of spots just to hold it in place. If you notice, I'm pinning it below the twill, the V in the twill, so that when I'm stitching, the pins aren't in the way. And then after I get done stitching, I can take the pins out, and it makes it easier to work. You don't need a lot of pins. I'd use 3, one at the middle, one at the beginning, and one at the end, just to hold it in place. because the stitching is really going to do the bulk of the work. So now we're going to the other end, and we'll just repeat that whole process. This will work on any size frame. I've done the same process on 10-foot frames. It just takes a little bit longer, but the process is exactly the same. Again, I'm starting my stitching with back stitches, and you can clearly see it's right on that V. And you can see how having the pin below the V keeps it out of the way, keeps the fabric secure while I'm making these initial stitches. And if you watch closely, you can see that after I put the pin in, or the needle rather, I bend the fabric over my finger on the other side, and that helps it to come back through. You see, even this is sheer fabric, it's very hard to see the V through that side, from stitching it from the fabric side. So that's why I always turn the bar over and do the stitching from the side of the twill tape, because if this were dark organza or this were a velvet or a heavy other fabric, you wouldn't be able to see the V. And that's what's so crucial about the stitch, is to keep it right on that V. If you want, you can actually count the little spaces between the rows of weaving to keep the stitches even, but after a while you get the sense of how long of a stitch you want. If you err on the side of smaller, larger stitches are not going to be useful. So when it's done, it should look like this. The two sides are facing out away from each other, and the fabric is soft in between. So now we have to put the sidebars on. But if we were to go to stretch this, you'd see what would happen. It would pull the twill tape against the way it's stapled to the bar. So that's not going to make a good tight frame. So to fix that problem, we simply take one of the bars, turn it over and flip it over the other bar, and then turn the bar one more time. Now the twill tape is stapled flat to the bar, so it's not folding back on itself, but the fabric is folding back on itself, and this helps to cover the raw edge of the fabric as you're working, so that you don't catch all of the threads coming off the fabric. And you can just see in here that there's the edge of there's the raw edge of the fabric, and now it's folded over itself, and that helps to keep it nice and clean. But more importantly, the twill tape is in a flat position, not folded back on itself. Now, if you have a larger piece of fabric, you can simply, and this is where you just stretch these apart and put the sidebars on, which we'll do next. But if this is a large piece of fabric, you can shorten it just by rolling it on one of the bars to expose the area that you want to do the bead work on. Do all the bead work, and then conversely unroll that side and roll up the other side. And then you can stretch a workable area. Now here we are set up ready to put on our sidebars. Now in this case, the twill tape, which is stapled on just like the big bar, is going to go face down so that it is sitting on top of the fabric. Now we also need to try to line this up as cleanly as we can to the grain, so that the closer we get, the easier it is to stretch. So what I do is I turn the bar over, take the edge of the fabric, hold it to the edge of the twill tape, turn it back, and then put a pin in just to secure it. Again, somewhere away from that first V. And I'll do that in a couple of spots along the bar. That just helps to keep it roughly on grain. And I'm going to stitch again on the first V toward the edge of the twill tape. But in this case, the fabric is lined up to the opposite edge of the twill tape underneath. And that makes sure that you're not stitching too close to a raw edge, because you can't see it. And it helps keep everything on grain. So I'm still going to stitch right on that V. And in this case, because of the direction I'm stitching and the angle, I will do a stab stitch up and down, and again a good knot and several back stitches at the beginning, which I didn't do here, but you should. And it just continues all the way down that side rail. And you would do the exact same thing to the other side. This way here, the bar and the twill tape cover the raw edge of the fabric as well. So once you get to the other end, if you have fabric rolled around your bar, it's crucial as you're stitching that you do not catch any of the twill tape or the fabric that is rolled around the bar, because you won't be able to stretch that corner. So I put a little pin as a marker, so I know don't stitch past this pin, because then it's going to catch the twill tape and the fabric that's rolled underneath it. That's very, very important. Every corner has to be independent. So you never want to stitch the two twill tapes together, because then you won't be able to stretch it. You won't be able to stretch the fabric. The next little video will be how to then put on the C-clamps and stretch up the fabric to work on.